Hi there. Today's presentation is on defining professionalism and being a professional. This is my opinion, which is why it's not in a company template. I see professionalism during my day all of the time, and sometimes I see a lack of professionalism as well. And it occurred to me that different people have different ideas on what a professional is, so I should put down somewhere exactly what it means to me, and hence this video. This is 20 rules basically that I try to work by every day. So, rule number one, be nice to your boss. Your boss is basically there to cover your back. You will eventually get into some kind of trouble, and it's nice to have that guy kind of sat behind you. Also, of course, he's responsible for your pay and your pay review, so definitely the number one person to be nice to is your boss, because hiring, firing, it's him. Rule number two is don't annoy people without a reason. There will always be conflict. You can't avoid it, but I try not to annoy people unless I've got a very good reason to do so. Sometimes you have to be confrontational. If you are going to be, don't get into a slagging match. Don't let things degenerate into arguments. And don't throw people out of windows. Communication, that's important at all levels. Knowing who you need to communicate to is sometimes an art form. Within my industry, I tend to communicate to my line manager, and at the same time, you have different people responsible for the different industries that you're working in. So making sure that everyone understands exactly what it is that I'm doing and understands when I like or dislike something is very important. Bearing in mind there are also these global sourcing issues with communication as well. We deal with people that have got a number of different languages, and sometimes to make sure that I'm understood when I'm talking to someone in, say, India or any other country, I'll actually ask them to repeat back information to me just to make sure that they've understood it. If you screw up, admit it. We all screw up. There's nothing wrong with screwing up occasionally. What I mean by this rule is don't try to cover up your mistakes when you make them. I don't necessarily mean you have to identify every mistake that you make, because that can be very bad as well, especially when you're working in a customer environment. If you're admitting to mistakes every 5 minutes, it's going to cause more harm than good. We all make mistakes. Sometimes I've made mistakes and I've managed to get around them before anyone else ever found out those mistakes were made in the first place. I do still tend to make sure that I communicate the major mistakes or anything that would impact more than one user, but I'll never engage in a cover-up because ultimately it will cause trouble. Don't be afraid to say I don't know. It's okay to say I don't know, as long as you follow it up with, but I'll find out. It's nothing more frustrating than when you get into a situation where you're expecting someone to know the answers. You ask a question and then they just say, I don't know. And then there's like this awkward silence and you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, you should actually know. If you don't know something, find it out. Remember you're providing a service. I like to think of myself from a contractor's perspective because I spent most of my career as a contractor. But basically, everybody who's employed is being paid to be employed and perform a job for their boss. And I kind of like to every now and then ask myself, are the people that are employing me getting good value for money? How is it I'm spending my time? And can I actually justify everything that I'm doing? Am I really representing the company in a good way? Thinking of yourself this way is also conducive to really good quality. Be proactive. It's important not to just let events kind of dictate the way that you're working. It's very easy to be in a position where you spend all of your time firefighting and reacting to things. But sometimes you should kind of step back and you should think, well, why are all of these things going on around me and what can I do to kind of solve them? And how can I avoid these issues that are happening from happening again? By sometimes stepping back and thinking, okay, well, I've seen all of these errors, they've happened several times, how can I mitigate them? You add to the quality of the service you're providing. Back things up. Now, whenever you make a change, you should back up what you're doing. Every day, most of the servers that you're running on, they're going to have backups taken. But that doesn't mean that if you're going to make a change to a file, that you shouldn't back it up first. Because if I'm making a change to a configuration file, if I don't back it up first and I do screw the file up, I've got to go to the operations people and I've got to get a restore from backup. And that can take hours and hours. It's way better to spend the 20 seconds to actually back up the file before I start. Be aware of your own ability. We all have things that we're good at, we all have things that we're bad at. I like to be very honest with myself as to what I'm good and what I'm bad at. I don't highlight to everyone the things that I'm bad at. But for example, I know that in my case, if I'm doing any front-end web design, that I'm going to typically take twice as long as someone that's really into doing that. It's not that I won't do a good job, it doesn't come so easy to me. I know I burn extra time and I'm never really happy with my work. And just knowing those things about me helps me when it comes to time estimation. Be aware of the people around you. Be aware of their strengths, be aware of their weaknesses, of their little peculiarities. Actually think about people before you actually talk to them. Some people are more direct than others. Other people need to be more softly treated. Bear this in mind. Decentralise. You should make sure that you look at things from other people's perspective, because other people have a very different view of the world to what you do. So trying to understand how another person perceives a situation or perceives a request from you is important, because it may shape the way that you actually decide to interact with people. Document. Documentation is really important. Everyone thinks documentation is evil, but in point of fact, a good set of documentation can prevent you from having all manner of problems. We can't remember all of the different things that are asked of us all of the time, so writing things down is really, really important. And it's also kind of important from a disaster recovery perspective, making sure that other people who come after you actually know how things are working and how you actually deal with things from a day-to-day perspective is all really important. If you don't do the documentation, then the chances are you'll never be able to escape from whatever industry it is you're in. Never say it was like that 3 years ago. Now, this is a personal hate of mine, and I actually added this to my rules because there were one or two people that I realise actually do say this kind of thing on a regular basis. Now, to me, when you say that, you're not saying a good thing. You're not kind of justifying your situation. What you're saying is, I've had 3 years to deal with this and I haven't dealt with it. Saying that the previous company that had the stuff didn't do something is never an excuse. You've got obligation as a professional to try and better the quality of things. And if you see something that needs to be fixed, you should be escalating that and you should go back and communicate things. Innovate. This is kind of the same as being proactive to a degree, but it's thinking forward. It's how can I improve the quality of my service? How can I improve things going into the future? Keeping an eye on some of the trends within your own technical competency and your own fields is a really good idea. Thinking about how things can be bettered, not just in your technical competency, but from a business perspective. Even if you're not a business guy, it is a really good idea, because any good idea that you have benefits the company and everyone around you. Know the rules. Now, sometimes you'll want to break rules. It's true. It's important to understand the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law when it comes to rules, because sometimes people put rules in with a specific intent, but the actual wording of the rule doesn't actually help you do your job from a day-to-day perspective. I always try to understand why the rules are being put into place, and if I'm going to break a rule, I make sure that I've got a very, very good excuse for doing so. And sometimes rules do have to be broken. Normally, when you're breaking a rule, you're introducing a risk, and risks, again, have to be communicated. Know why you're doing the stuff that you're doing. It's one thing to actually do something for someone, but you sometimes get a completely different picture if you start to understand exactly why it is that you're doing things. And it kind of helps you also if you're in a situation that's just slightly different to anything that you've come across before. I had some experience in a previous job where I had a systems administrator who knew lots and lots about systems. He was a fairly senior fella, and he was great while things were like normal, and why you didn't really have to have innovative, creative thinking. But the second we had a system problem which was just a little bit different to what he's ever seen before, things would just not work for him because he didn't understand the whys of the different things that he did from day to day. So understanding why things work the way that they do is really important when it comes to both technical stuff and when it comes to understanding people's motivations or the questions that they ask you. Prioritization is very, very important. It's very easy to get sucked into a relatively minor, low priority problem for hours and hours when you should actually be concentrating on things that are more important to you. It's important to have a good idea of what's most important to who, and then to effectively prioritize it. And if you can't do this by yourself, you go to the manager in charge and you ask them to help. Socializing is kind of important as well. I don't socialize nearly enough, but it's kind of important to understand the people that you're working with, not just from a professional perspective, but from a personal one. Because how people are from a personal perspective does actually impact the way that you're going to work with them. And it's always nice to socialize. Keep track of how you're spending your time. Now, if you were to actually sit down for a week and write down absolutely everything that you were doing from hour to hour, you'd probably be fairly surprised about how much time you spend on some activities and how much time you don't. Having a good idea of how you're spending your time is really positive from a productivity perspective because you get to understand how you can actually improve your efficiency. Sometimes I've implemented weekly reports with some customers where I've justified things hour by hour, just to get them kind of comfortable with the fact that they're actually getting value for money. Generally speaking, I don't like to do like extensive time reporting. It's enough that we have to do it within my job, but know how formal to be. Now there's an art here. I'm not talking about dress code because of course there is formal versus informal dress code. Knowing how much you can and can't tell a customer is really important. You've got to always bear in mind that you're a representative of the company that you're in, and that you've got to think about liability. You don't want to be dishonest with the customer, but at the same time you can't just admit every mistake that you make, not without consulting your manager, so you can actually do some kind of damage control there. This also applies to your emails. Think twice before you CC a customer in on an internal conversation. It's very important to look at the distribution of any email that you get before you reply. And finally, the last rule, have fun. It's important that you have fun in your day-to-day work, because if you're not having fun, then you're not going to be doing as good a job as you could be. So if you can find a way of having fun, make sure you highlight that to the relevant manager. Thank you.